I got a random phone call. It was a second lieutenant and some 3-star calls me up in my queue room. I'm eating lunch. And he said, were you serious about wanting that fighter, or were you just making a point that women couldn't fly? And I said, oh, I absolutely want to fly the fighter. And they said, well, you'd be first, and there'd be a lot of media and attention. And I said, well, I don't want any of the media or attention. I'd rather be like number 50, where no one cares. I just want to go fly the fighter. And they go, well, that's not the timing. Like, there would be a lot of attention. And I said, well, if those are the terms of the deal, I'll take it.
All right, we are here, and what a great crowd we have. I think many of you came in later, which is excellent because you're here. So glad that you've come out tonight. My name is Mary Eintema. I'm the president of WorldBoston, and it's really a pleasure to be with you. Before I do anything else, I really want to thank our host, Folian Lardner. James DeBellis is here, as well as my tutor. Thank you so much for your hospitality tonight. And I want to point out Natalie Mace, who is managing everything, our Director of Operations and Global Engagement Programs, along with any other WorldBoston staff who are here, so you can ask them everything. Yay. Yay, staff. And we have, try and keep this short, but we have several WorldBoston board members right here up front, so raise your hands and you can ask them everything else. A few reminders. As you may know, our mission is to foster international engagement and global cooperation. So we thank you for doing that with us. As we've said for over 2 years now, the mission persists, and boy, it has been some persistence. So thank you for being here. We hope that you'll continue to participate. I see so many new faces, which is outstanding. For those to whom that's meaningful, scan the QR code and come on back to more of our events, because surely civic engagement is how we're going to get through whatever the next years bring. Now, we are so excited to actually have in person here tonight in this room not only Major General Jeannie Leavitt of the U.S. Air Force, but also an expert moderator, our WorldBoston friend and party professor Jack Weinstein, who also happens to be a retired U.S. Air Force Lieutenant General. So I'm taking the liberty of abbreviating both their bios. You can find them online. But to get to it, our moderator, Jack Weinstein, served in the Air Force from '82 to 2018 and is now the professor, it's the greatest title ever, of the practice of international security at the Pardee School of Global Studies. And prior to the Pardee School, he was Deputy Chief of Staff for Strategic Deterrence and Nuclear Integration at the headquarters of the U.S. Air Force and the Pentagon. And I'm going to cut it short, but it's interesting. He came up through our ROTC, so you can ask him about that. And we're so honored to be here tonight with Major General Jeannie M. Leavitt, who is the Chief of Safety at the headquarters of the U.S. Air Force in Arlington and commander of the Air Force Safety Center at the Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico. She develops, executes, and evaluates all U.S. air and space forces, aviation, ground, weapons, space, and system mishap prevention, and nuclear surety programs to preserve combat capability. Additionally, she directs research to promote safety awareness and mishap prevention. And finally, she manages, develops, and directs all safety and management courses. I think I read 300,000 people a year. Wow. General Leavitt entered the Air Force in 1992 after earning her degrees at the University of Texas and Stanford. She earned her commission as a distinguished graduate also of ROTC, and she was the first female fighter pilot in the U.S. Air Force and the first woman to command a USAF combat fighter wing. More than 3,000 hours as a command pilot. Her operational experiences include Southern Watch, Northern Watch, Iraqi Freedom, and Enduring Freedom. Prior to her current assignment, General Leavitt served as Director of Operations and Communications at the headquarters of Air Education and Training Command at San Antonio, Randolph. And I'm skipping along because we need to get into it. And I think we want to hear what she has to say next rather than I. So welcome to WorldBoston General Leavitt. It's really an honor to have you with us. And Jack, as he keeps saying, it's good to see you again.
Thank you.
Right ahead.
Okay, so good evening, and thank you all. Hello, sir. Thank you all for inviting me, and I'm excited to spend a little time with you. My normal day job is safety. Air Force, Police Force, and all the different disciplines, so I've had the opportunity to learn more about some of the our Air Force and Space Force. Thing that ties into the WorldBoston that I find pretty interesting is we have a lot of international engagement opportunities. And these are great because safety is safe, if you say. You know, it's not aggressive, it's not confrontational. How can anyone be upset about people cooperating on space? So a few weeks ago, for example, when I was out at my Air Force Safety Center, we had the Taiwanese Air Force visiting, and so we hosted their delegation. Of these training courses we have in all different types of mishap prevention, safety board training, and how we determine what caused a mishap. One of the things we have is called our International Flight Safety Officer course, IFSO. In fact, their graduation for our latest class was on Friday, and I was there at Kirtland as their graduation speaker. So that was really cool to be part of that. The students were so excited, and they build such great friendships and bonds. We had more than 20 students from about 18 countries from around the world, and they all learn about how to build safety mishap prevention programs, and then how to handle if there is a mishap. And so the international engagement opportunity is fantastic. We had a UAE delegation come over a few months back, and the lead was a colonel, and I was talking with them, and he said, "Oh, I remember when I went to IFSO 10 years ago," and he was finally remembering his time at Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so it's neat that we have that ability to engage with our international partners in an area where it's safe, if you will. So this week, I'm here for a different reason. This is supporting one of my former commands, which was recruiting. And so from 2018 to 2020, I was the commander of Air Force Recruiting Service. And that was completely new and different and way outside of anything I had done before. I'd mostly flown Strike Eagles and done operational type missions. But the whole mission of recruiting is inspire, engage, and recruit the next generation of airmen and guardians. We added that during my time because in December of 2019, we stood up the United States Space Force. So we'd recruit for them. And so periodically what we do is we have general officers and we bring a whole team together. We have a few captains that I've been meeting with, some lieutenants, one major, and we go see all different parts of the city. So I've been all around. I have driven the streets around Boston, I'll tell you that. I mean, I've been to Brockton, I've been to Peabody. Did I say that right?
You pronounced it correctly?
Yeah. You know. But I've been to a number of schools in the area and done some serious driving to have that outreach and that engagement. And quite honestly, Brockton had the best deal of everyone because we brought in the Air Force's rock band. We have some bands, and we have one rock band. Full Spectrum is their name, and it was wild. It was like a full-up rock concert in their, school auditorium, and so it was neat. And what was great is the band really tailors to whatever the audience is, and so there were teachers getting the students to stop crowd surfing and things like that. Like no, stop. But it was really neat to see the engagement. So. I've been in the Air Force for a long time, and I've had a lot of opportunities, and a little bit of my bio was read, but I'd really like to have the conversation with you, sir, and hear what is on your mind, because we could really talk about anything. And I'm excited to be here with you tonight. So, over to you, sir.
Okay, so a few things up front. First of all, we have a whole bunch of BU students. Please raise your hand. I'm proud of all of you. And we have ROTC cadets. Come on, ROTC folks, come on, raise your hand. And I have to do this because I love the camaraderie of the services. We have 5 Air Force ROTC cadets here and 1 Marine. So I think that is equal. And an Army, right. Sorry about that. Very interesting story, but that's another story, so we'll talk about that. So you have a really fascinating career. And I think what everyone would be interested in hearing about, especially for some of our students that are going to try to get into areas or careers that traditionally maybe people didn't want them in. So kind of talk about it's great to say that you're the first, but being the first can be very challenging. So can you talk a little bit about it and what you did to either prepare yourself or to excel as you did?
Sure. Well, it was not nearly as smooth as it sounds when it's announced in an intro at all. So we kind of got to go back in time. I started pilot training in January of 1992 and graduated January 1993. So if you put yourself back in time, at that time, Congress had changed the law that was in place until 1991. And that law was women were not allowed in combat. Well, starting in 1991, the law changed. Women were allowed in combat. However, the Department of Defense had a policy, and the policy was no women in combat. They didn't do away with that when Congress changed the law. So in my mind, we're kind of in some gray zone here. Well, when I finished pilot training, at the time they would have you make your selection based on merit order. And so when it came time for assignments, there was an F-15E Strike Eagle, which was the airplane I most definitely wanted, in that drop. And I got called into my commander's office and they said, okay, you finished first in the class, but you cannot pick a fighter, a bomber, or a special ops airplane. And if you're going to pick an airplane you can't fly, please have the professional courtesy to let us know. I was like, yes, sir. And I had no idea what to do. And I received an unbelievable amount of unsolicited advice from every instructor pilot in my flight, and it was universal. Do not ask for the fighter. They said, you will ruin your career. You will forever be labeled a troublemaker because you'll be asking for an airplane that you know you can't have, and you will ruin your career. I was like, that's a little scary to hear. And so I talked a lot to my family, and I said, what I don't want to have happen is what I know will happen, which is at some point in the future. I don't know if it'll be weeks, months, or years, but at some point, Department of Defense is going to have to change a policy because the law's changed. What I don't want is I don't want the regret of saying, man, I always wanted to fly a fighter. And people go, well, did you even ask? And so I went to my leadership and I explained that. And I'm like, I was the trouble lieutenant for sure. And so when the time of our drop came, I got pulled out just prior. And they said, okay, here's how it's all going to play out. You'll ask for the fighter. We'll tell them Air Force personnel will come back and say you're not qualified and make another selection. And they said, at that point, the ball's in your court, and I hope you make the right choice. And I said, I will, sir. So it was pretty anticlimactic for me. The auditorium was packed. Everyone knew, hey, there's a girl that finished first, and she can't have a fighter. Is she going to ask for it? So I was pretty scared. I tried to, sound cool, look cool, sound cool on the radios. So I stood up and I asked for the F-15E, and they quoted DOD policy and told me to make another choice. So I did. I picked a KC-10 to March Air Force Base because there were no trainers available. And I was disappointed, but I had no regrets. I'm like, you know what? I asked for what I wanted. My timing just happened to be bad. And I am going to be the best KC-10 pilot this Air Force has ever seen. And off I went to California. And I was like, okay. Well, I think I didn't realize it, but behind the scenes, people were noticing, hey, Congress did change the law, and Department of Defense is kind of ignoring them, and Congress doesn't usually like that. So 3 months later, when the law did, or the policy did change, they remembered that second lieutenant that stood up and asked for the airplane that she couldn't have. And I'll give the Air Force credit because I went in eyes wide open. I got a phone call, a random phone call. It was a second lieutenant and some 3-star calls me up in my queue room. I'm eating lunch. And he said, were you serious about wanting that fighter, or were you just making a point that women couldn't fly? And I said, oh, I absolutely want to fly the fighter. And they said, well, you'd be first, and there'd be a lot of media and attention. And I said, well, I don't want any of the media or attention. I'd rather be like number 50, where no one cares. I just want to go fly the fighter. And they go, well, that's not the timing. Like, there would be a lot of attention. And I said, well, if those are the terms of the deal, I'll take it. And they go, no, nothing's changed. Go back to training. I was like, what? And so for the whole next week, I'm in the training room, because at this point my assignment had changed. I was going to be a T-38 instructor. And I'd be walking by like, any messages? Anyone call? Anything? And then a week or so later is when they made the announcement. So they flew me up to D.C. and the path started. And it was a very unique experience. But I do credit the Air Force for, making sure I knew what I was walking into, because it was challenging. There were people that did not want me there.
You brought up a really, really good point, which is you look at someone, it doesn't matter if you're in the military or you're working here in any capacity, you look at someone's just career flow, right? And there's heartache between the lines that you don't see the heartache until you have that discussion. For the Air Force ROTC folks, I filled out my dream sheet. That's what you want. I was in college. I went to UMass Lowell, so I'm a really local boy. And I filled out my dream sheet, and I gave it to my captain. And the captain looked at it and ripped it up. And he goes, that's not where you're going. You're going to be a missile person. And I said, okay. So I filled out the dream sheet, and then he ripped that one up. And I went back and I said, Captain, it would be so much easier if you just filled out the form, and then I'll sign it. And then so he filled out the form, and I signed it, and it worked out well. It was very scary, though, to be the cadet having your form kept ripped up because they didn't want you to do something else. Hey, for all the BU students that at least to take my classes, there's a Colonel Paul Murphy. Paul, raise your hand. You are not allowed to talk to Paul. Paul and I work really closely in the Air Force, so just be careful when you talk to Paul. Hey, I'm going to ask one more question. I'm going to pick on, if, at least for the students, I know some of you really well. You better think of a question because I'm going to call you. Talk to me a little bit about recruiting. We're in a little bit of a challenge now in recruiting. What did you have to do to kind of change how we recruit kind of the best people on the planet to be in the Air Force?
Sure. So recruiting is very dependent on the environmentals in terms of what's going on in society. So when I first went there in 2018, the economy was great, unemployment was low, great for the nation, tough for recruiting. And so it was a rather challenging time, and nothing compared to now, but it was a rather challenging time. And so one of the things that we did was with the mission was that inspire, engage, and recruit. And I realized that if I could get my recruiters all the resources they needed, all the training they needed, they were really good at their job. They could talk to folks and tell them about all the opportunities. And then I could focus my attention on the inspire, engage. And so that was a lot of the engagement at schools, high schools, colleges, community events, all of these things for that engagement. But on that journey, what we found is we'd be at events, and we were somewhat disjointed in our recruiting efforts. So when I first got to recruiting, they briefed me on all these statistics, and some of them I didn't believe, because they said, okay, this is before we had a Space Force. So they said to this group of 17 to 35-year-olds, they said, can you name the 4 services within the Department of Defense? Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. That's all they asked. Can you name those 4? 49% could name those 4. I'm like, wow. Okay, so half the people do not know those 4. So when we're trying to recruit for Air Force Reserves or Air National Guard or Air Force Academy or Air Force ROTC, it just confuses the public. And so we started on this journey of what we called total force recruiting, which was to pool our resources. Like, let's all recruit for the United States Air Force and find the right fit. It can be full or part-time, in or out of uniform, but rather than sending this confusing message to the American public that's already fairly unfamiliar, we could join forces. And so it's been really, it was a really great journey to go through as we were doing that in recruiting.
You know, what's really interesting is there was a period of time when they really wanted us, this is well after 9/11, so I'm talking the 2015, 2016 timeframe, they really wanted us to fly commercially in uniform so the American public would know who we are, right? So I am wearing the Airman's Battle uniform, so it's a fatigue type uniform. My name's on it, I have rank on it, and I'm on an airplane, and this lady sitting next to me, and it wasn't really rude, she goes, "So what do you do?" And I go, "Well, this is odd. I'm in the Air Force." She goes, "You look kind of old." And I go, "Well, kind of."
It's all relative.
It's all relative, right? And kind of the stars stick out, and she goes, "So you can't find a job." Right? So it was humorous. And then I spent the entire flight explaining to her about the United States Air Force because she had no clue about what we are and what we do, and that this was a volunteer thing. You know, we talked about the economy. I like looking at an audience where there are people that are my age, even older. But when I graduated college, I got my first car at a great interest rate because I had good credit. 18.1%. So the economy was really rough. So I applaud the work that you did for recruiting because it is really tough to try to get people to understand the value that it is inside the United States Air Force when you really don't know people are. Do we have questions from the audience?
Yeah, again, this is to the Major General. It's such an honor to have you with us. And I'm just interested as to what was the impetus for you to go into the Air Force, and also once you were there, why you wanted to fly the F-15.
Okay, great. Well, that'll even show you more how messy my actual bio is, because I considered myself the accidental cadet. I was at the University of Texas studying aerospace engineering. Didn't know anything about Air Force, or I was designing planes, didn't know much about, never been behind the controls of a plane. And I was working every other semester to get job experience, because at the time that was a big thing if you wanted to get a job in aerospace engineering. I was working at NASA Johnson Space Center. And I randomly crossed paths with a second lieutenant who was waiting for pilot training. And I had never heard of this. I said, okay, so let me get this straight. The Air Force pays to make you a pilot, and then they pay you to be a pilot. And he's like, yes, it's called pilot training. I was like, man, that sounds really cool. So I asked him about a million questions, went back to UT, and I said, I want to be a pilot. And being aerospace engineering and having a good GPA, they were like, all right, let's talk. I went to field training camp between my sophomore and junior year, 100% unprepared. I had never put a uniform on in my life. Everyone in the camp knew me day one, and that's not a good thing. So it was a little bit of a rough start, but there's nowhere to go but up. And so it got better from there. And while I was there, I got the opportunity that was my first time behind the controls, even though I'd already told everyone I wanted to be a pilot. I got to go in a T-37 and be at the controls. And I was like, this is amazing. And I was very happy since I'd already said I wanted to be a pilot. But that next summer, between junior and senior year, you got to shadow someone in your career field. This is going to kind of paint me as a rebel. But what happened is they said, okay, list the airplanes that you would like to shadow in. Now this is at 1989, prior to 91, right? So I'm like, okay, F-16, F-15, F-4, F-11. Those all sound really cool. And so the NCOs at the detachment, they come back and they go, Cadet, you can't put those airplanes. And I said, why not? They said, because you could never fly them. I said, I know I can't fly them. I'm not asking to go to them. I'm just saying I want to shadow. And he goes, they said, no, you can't put airplanes you can't go to. And I said, well, I think that's all the more reason they should send me, since I will never fly one of those. They're like, you can't. And I said, well, with all due respect, I'm not going to change it. I go, look, I will be happy with absolutely anything. But they asked where I wanted, so I'm not going to change it. And then everyone was completely shocked when it came back and I got an F-16 base. And when I showed up at the F-16 base, everyone's like, what are you doing here? We've never had a female cadet. I'm like, I don't know. I put it on the list. And so I ended up with 5 backseat rides, and I was hooked. Because the first ride or two, you're very disoriented. But come ride 3 and 4, and I had some great instructor pilots that I flew with, and they would take the time after we landed to go through the debrief and explain the radar and how everything was working, and the engineer geek in me would come out. And so it wasn't this grand plan. It was, opportunities presented themselves, and I jumped on them.
Great, thank you.
Okay, you talked about recruiting earlier, and I noticed when all the ROTC cadets walked in that they're all in really good shape. One of the big problems we have in this country, you guys can all stand up if you want,
Yes.
Which would actually really show what my point I'm trying to make and why it's important to you guys. There was an article in the New York Times a few months back about the huge, and I mean huge problems the military in general is having about finding enough people to fit, okay? Who are in shape or who aren't overweight. And one of the things that's causing all this overweightness is, frankly, a lot of sugar and corn syrup in processed food. Have you thought of going as a group to Congress, whoever, the FDA, whoever, and saying, this is causing a huge problem in our recruiting. We need to get all this corn syrup out of processed foods and sugar. I mean, you find it in foods it shouldn't be in, like hot sauce, for God's sakes.
Well, I will say I'm absolutely tracking the challenge with the recruiting pool, because what's really concerning is back in 2018, when I first got to recruiting, they came and they briefed along with those other statistics. They showed me that, out of the 20 million people in the primary demographic for recruiting, that what was at the time, because it's gotten worse. At the time, it's gotten worse just in the few years. And so it was 75% were not eligible to serve, like not even eligible, based on either physical condition or in some cases it was weight issues, or it could be academics or criminal record or drug use. And so I was like, wow, that's terrible. But we recently re-looked at it, and the numbers are trending in the wrong direction. I do know that there's a group of retired general officers that are very engaged on that. And sir, over to you.
So as a retired general officer, I am really engaged in this. I'm a member of a group. We've gotten, not only do we write letters to members of Congress and to states, we advocate on changing the rules on what can be offered in schools.
Okay.
We've been pretty successful.
Hospitals?
What?
Hospitals? You'd be surprised the stuff that they feed people in hospitals.
Yeah, no, but we're really focused on really schools, and we're really careful about this. Our job isn't to recruit more people for the United States military. Our job is to create a healthy citizen. That's what we want to create, and that's kind of what we focus on. And then just one thing to tie this up, for a period of time in my life, I built the Air Force Space budget, now the Space Force, and I built the Air Force budget. It is much easier to come up when they say, hey, we want to grow the force. That is a very different discussion than saying you need another $2 billion. I can come up with $2 billion in a wink. Coming up with another 15,000 or 20,000 people is very, very difficult. Yeah. That's why we applaud the people that have served and that want to serve, because it's really a small group of people in this country which has to be corrected.
Thank you very much. Full disclosure, retired Army. Okay, my question is about obedience. The services reluctantly obey orders only when they must. A good example, we're now in our 80th year of trying to integrate services. The National Security Act 1947, Goldwater-Nichols of 86, and the Ash-Carter study all were trying to form a unified military establishment in which there would be no overlaps and unnecessary gaps. But that hasn't worked too well. So in your opinion, how can we better approach this so that we get the requirements that we want without having to pay for the overlaps and gaps that exist today?
Want me to take that on?
Sure. You've worked in resourcing. I haven't.
I think so we talked about the 1947 National Security Act, created the Air Force, the CIA, National Security Council. There was also the Goldwater-Nichols Act. 1986 Goldwater-Nichols Act to create more joint officers, those officers that work in commands with Navy, Air Force, and Army. I think the military, while we can always do better, we do a pretty good job of integrating with the other services. So I don't want to make this a class, but I'm going to have to. Really, right? The way the United States military is organized is we have military services, right? We have an Air Force, we have an Army, we have a Navy, we have a Marine Corps, we have a Space Force. Even though they're in the Department of Homeland Security, we have a Coast Guard, and we have, excellent, and we have a Guard. The military services in this nation do not fight wars. The Air Force, Army, Navy does not fight wars. Combatant commanders fight wars. We have combatant commanders, we have a Europe, we have a Pacific, we have a strategic command for nuclear, we have a space command. Those commands have all services working inside that. So I'm a nuclear guy by trade, nuclear, space, and cyber guy. I worked really closely with my Navy boss and my Air Force boss, and the integration is pretty good. I will tell you, though, that there is always competition among the services. And the reason why there are competition among the services is because that is human nature when it comes to wanting to be better than the next person. But I do think when it comes to the integration piece, Congress passed a rule to make sure that the combatant commanders can actually integrate. Those are the Army, those are Pacific Command, European Command. The person responsible for integrating the United States military is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So while we can always do a better job on the integration piece, we are an awful lot better than maybe people when you look from the military from the outside on the inside. And one more point I want to get across. It has nothing to do with the question, but it's something I'm really passionate about. If you look at, what is the difference between the United States military and the Russians? We have a non-commissioned officer corps. That non-commissioned officer corps is what leads our fight. So in other militaries, it's this centralized hierarchy that drives everything. And in the United States military, I don't tell someone how to do it, I tell them what needs to get done. And that is done by the non-commissioned officer corps. So I think overall, the way we're organized and the way we do things, I think we're pretty good. Can we always get better? Yeah. Does it cost a lot of money for the United States military? Yeah, it's too big. I get all that. But I think the bottom line is we do a really good job of integrating among the services. And now it's normal because this very talented person to my left could not be a general officer unless A, she had a joint billet in her career, and number two, in order for her to put on her star, she went to joint training with all the other services. So we forced that in training and in operation. Thanks.
And the only thing I'll add is there's a number of efforts underway specific to safety. We just stood up a joint safety council, which I'm the initial chair of, and it's all the services. And Congress didn't put Coast Guard, but we're putting Coast Guard in and then letting Congress know because we're like, of course we need the Coast Guard in there. But to formalize some of these things, and quite honestly, we are in some cases like the Navy has gotten onto our system for the backbone and. So there's good coordination within certain areas. Sure, we could get better, but there is progress.
Okay, thank you both very much. What we're going to do, because I'm conscious of time and conscious of how many excellent conversations are waiting to happen around the room, so we're going to actually take two questions at once, and then we'll wrap up our Q&A portion and just go back to networking. And allow everybody to mix and mingle. So let's get one after the other.
Yeah, so I've read similar articles to the New York Times when that was mentioned over the decline in people willing to enlist, shortages. And yes, they mentioned weight issues, they mentioned employment rates, even like certain advertisements that weren't well received. I think you know what I'm referencing. But then also, of course, naturally, weariness over long deployments or campaigns, and it's not a unique phenomenon because it also happened immediately after Vietnam and the fall of Saigon. But after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, that left much to be desired. I think the general public had a low opinion over current operations, but then also felt less motivated. And I'm just wondering from the inside out what that looks like when it comes to recruiting, when like public opinion and just, you know, political perception of wars or conflicts plays a role.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Do you want to go ahead with your question?
You talked about you're having trouble recruiting. Have you talked to like private industry and how you could work together? I'm thinking specifically about the airlines in your case because you're in the Air Force. A friend of mine's a retired pilot. We were talking about this, and he just said, if you talk to like working with the airlines, maybe you could work together. You could train people. People could work for, say you could train them. They could work for the airline 6 months, work for you 6 months. And this is just off the top of my head, but something of that nature, like an apprenticeship program, something like that.
Sure. So to address those both tied to recruiting, with the first one, I would say one of the challenges we face, quite honestly, is that disconnect with a lot of the American public with the military. And so if you don't actually know someone in the military and interact with them on a regular basis, your primary source of reference is either the media or movies. And the media tends to focus on all the negative stories because that's what gets attention. That's what's going to have you click on it when it gets that catchy, headline. And they don't tell you all the good news stories because no one will click. So they don't tell those stories. And then for movies, Hollywood can choose to be accurate or not in their portrayal. No hit on Hollywood at all. They're the entertainment industry, and so they can choose how they portray things. And sometimes sometimes we're portrayed accurately, sometimes not so much. And so that certainly does not help on the recruiting side of things. And the Air Force is fortunate, and then it's the one service we're going to make our active duty goals. So we're very fortunate in that. But with the Guard and Reserve, we're running into more challenges. And so I would say that. And then I'll defer to you on the pilot side and with airlines and whatnot. Absolutely. When it comes to pilots specifically, what we're trying to do is partner with the airlines, with other professional organizations, to increase the pool, because right now the pool is small and we're all fighting over the same pool of pilots. And so rather than doing that, we're trying to find some creative ways to partner with different organizations and have different pathways and get exposure to kids to get the interest in pilot training. We don't have a problem recruiting pilots. That's the one place where we definitely don't have an issue. It's the production side of things. We can't produce them fast enough. So we're at max capacity with production, but we have definitely looked at a number of partnership opportunities and creative ways to do things. Or, maybe after pilot training, we don't have a 10-year commitment. Maybe you do 6 years active duty and then you transition to the reserves and you go to the airlines or things like that. And so we're looking at all kinds of creative possibilities. Sorry.
Yeah, my wife can't watch movies with me about the military because I'm always yelling at the TV. That's not the way it is. There's a couple of shows I like, and I go, oh my God, A couple of items. One on the recruiting piece. I teach a course because it's soup to nuts of Department of Defense. I had an Army enlisted individual who's at BU getting a master's degree and was getting commissioned as an officer to do cyber type issues. He wrote a brilliant paper on how to improve recruiting, at least for the United States Army, because what the current generation wants is different than maybe what recruited me, right? So, and we provided that to the Army. Now, what they do with it, who knows, but it was a really, really good paper that the student wrote. The other item is you asked a really big question that requires a longer discussion. We need to figure out when do we use our military? When you only have 1.3 million people in active duty, that is a very small percentage of people that are serving the nation. We have a reserve and we have a guard, but when you look at the people that are serving, it's a very, very small percentage. it is really easy to say, I think the military needs to do X. And this became personal for me. Remember the Marine barracks getting blown up in Lebanon? In Beirut, Lebanon, 1983? Well, I'm home and I'm at a family get-together, and my family's talking about, we need to send the boys in. No insult to anyone, but it was only boys at the time. They were in combat. We need to send the boys in. And I'm drinking a beer, and I go, so what boys are you talking about? And they go, well, we need to send the boys in. I go, well, in this family get-together, I'm the only boy. So it's all right for me to go into Lebanon, but you don't want to go? The reason why I'm giving this long story, we have to figure out when we use the United States military. It is a finite resource. In my little view, that's going to sound emotional, we can always talk about vital national security. That's a word I don't understand what it means. Vital national security means something different to everybody else. I think if someone in Congress, it's great to be retired. I think if someone in Congress is willing to sacrifice their family member, their child, their grandchild, then maybe the cause is worth it. Right? Because I have a son. So I had children early. I have a son who's 37 and 35. My 37-year-old, I have a grandson who's 2.5. I don't want him to go into a conflict because some old person in Washington thinks it's a good idea to send the boys in. It's got to be vital for that. And I don't think we're having that discussion in this country, because in this country we're talking about other crap, right, to be blunt. I think we need to have the discussion because it's true. You can't bring someone into the military to serve their nation and then give them substandard housing if some of the dorms are bad, which some of the services have bad dorms, and then continually deploy them. Remember, we recruit individuals, we retain families. And that's kind of the bottom line. So I think we need to have a really good discussion about when we use military force, and I think in this country we have not had that discussion. But we're going to have to, because as the general talked about, the amount of people that can actually wear the uniform and that can pass everything is getting smaller and smaller every single year. So we have an issue to talk about, but it's a bigger discussion that we're not going to solve tonight, but we need to have the discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so General Leavitt, welcome to Boston, where we specialize in opinions. So, anyway, please join me in thanking General Jeannie Leavitt and our wonderful moderator, Jack Weinstein. So hope to see you all online tomorrow night with Sir Kevin Rudd. Please come back and see us soon. We're still here for another 15 minutes or so I hope you enjoy the evening. Thanks for coming out.